So, hello and welcome to Asynchronous and Unreliable, a new weekly podcast where we discuss the most interesting ideas and concepts in tech. I'm your host, Anne Curry, co-author of Building Green Software, The Cloud Native Attitude, and author of the science fiction Panopticon series. And for our guest today, we have my friend, long-term collaborator, and co-author of the second version of The Cloud Native Attitude, Charles Humble. So, Charles, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I've been in IT in various different ways for, over 30 years at this point. I started in desktop support. I, then became a programmer and a senior programmer and architect, and eventually a CTO. I was CTO for a startup that got acquired, and then I switched to more content stuff. So I was InfoQ's chief editor from about 2014, I think, to 2020, about 6 years there. And then chief editor for Container Solutions, where you and I both were from, in my case, 2020 to about 2023. And now I am back freelancing. So I do about 2.5 days a week as a consultant. And I do about half of that on sustainability. And I do about the other half of it working with, it's actually very hard to describe, working with teams who are doing really cutting edge things, helping them to think through what they're doing and articulate what they're doing. Is the easiest way I can describe it. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. So that's about half of my time. And then the other half of my time is I do some training and I do some tech journalism stuff. I speak at conferences, and I'm a middle class white guy, so obviously I also host a podcast because that's the law now, I think. And then I'm a composer in half of an ambient techno band called Two Fish. I'm also, a father and have 2 children, so life is pretty busy.
Now, it's interesting that you said we'll be talking all day. You started to talk about what you did day to day. But that is, in fact, exactly what I want to be talking about in the
Well, that's
podcast today. So we met, actually, although you say you were editor of chief editor of Container Solutions, where we both worked, we actually met some years before that when you were editor of InfoQ magazine.
Yeah.
And we met. And that is kind of the thing, that the subject that I want to speak, that is related to the topic that I want to be talking about today. So we met when we were co-organizers of a big UK tech conference called QCon.
Mm-hmm.
For many years, actually, we did that.
Yep.
And we've worked on lots of projects since. But I kind of want to talk about that and about communicating complex tech concepts, which at the time, that was nearly 10 years ago that we first started working together on QCon. Tech conferences were the way to communicate complicated topics, really.
Yep.
More than, well, obviously you can read books, and we both write books, or we both co-authored books, but tech conferences were a more interactive way to do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm quite interested. I want us to talk today about the progress of how communications of complex subjects has happened through your career, because you've seen it you've been absolutely part of the inside track on communicating complex topics in tech.
Yeah. Oh, that's such an interesting. Yeah, it's such an interesting area. And you're right. I think there was a period of time when all of that was happening at conferences. I mean, it goes in cycles, I think. So when I was growing up and learning programming, I learned from reading programming magazines.
Oh, so did I.
So if you go back to the 8-bit era, there were magazines. There was one I remember called Input, for example, and every week it would have like a bunch of programming listings. And you would, you could sort of type them in, and that was how that's pretty much how I learned to code. There were also like games magazines. There was one called Zap64, but they would get games developers who had worked out how to do really interesting things with the kind of hardware of the day to write articles about what they'd discovered. Like, some with the Commodore 64, I might get this wrong now, but as I recall it, you could have, I think it was 16 sprites at any one time. And then someone worked out a way you could basically fool the processor into allowing you to have a whole load more by using like very low level raster interrupts or something like that. I forget the details now. It was 40 years ago. But it would have been a raster interrupt of some kind. And again, somebody worked out how to do that, and then they put that in a magazine, and then we could all know how to do it. So there was a time when that was how we learned.
Mm.
And in fact, because I have a sort of weird background, because I did an English literature degree and then got a job in computing. So I had to learn all of my computing through a mixture of, on the job, but also by going off and reading, the structure and interpretation of computer programs and the Gang of Four, the design patterns book. And that was how
Yeah.
I learned the stuff that I would otherwise have learned through my degree.
Yeah.
So I learned that through books. But you're right. I think there was a shift for a while that happened, and I think it happened probably as a result of a couple of different things. One of those was the period of time when software became very, very proprietary,
Mhm.
um, and became a sort of secret source that we weren't allowed to talk about. And I think that was part of what happened. And so it was very difficult
And
to talk about what you.
that was the situation at the beginning of my career 30
Yeah,
years ago. It was like it was like there was no information. It was kind of like you had to, well, it was illegal to reverse engineer code, but you ended up having to do it all the time
yeah, yeah,
because you fired things in and then saw what came back out because you needed to know what APIs looked like to talk to the code. And
yeah.
obviously, often the documentation, even if it was supposed to be documented, was so terrible that the only way you could work out how it worked was to reverse engineer it.
Yes, I mean, Microsoft was a bit of a counterexample to that, I think, because Microsoft,
Mm.
because I mean, you could make an argument that says that the reason we ended up with proprietary software was because of Bill Gates. If you go back to his very early days, and there was a memo that he wrote, this home computing memo, and he was basically saying, sharing software is the death to the software industry. That memo. Um, but a side effect was Microsoft was one of the very few companies that took, well, one of the very few tech companies, I should say, that took technical documentation seriously.
Yeah,
Um, because they had to. Because if you wanted people to write on Windows, the only way you could do that is if the APIs were properly documented. So
yeah.
they hired really good writers. They paid them properly, which is a novelty. And as a result, like the Windows API documentation, it's still like the benchmark of really good documentation. And actually, Azure, I mean, Azure has its faults, but that mentality, I think, carried on through. If you look at Azure's docs versus Google's docs and AWS's docs, none of them are perfect, but Microsoft's are so much better than anyone else's. And it's because I think they had a culture of taking documentation really seriously, kind of from the get go. But yeah, I mean, I'd certainly remember, early Java days, and literally there were things you could use that would reverse bytecode back into readable Java code. There were ways to do that, and I remember trying to figure out what something was doing, and the only way I could do it was literally to reverse engineer the source code and go and read it.
Yeah,
Which, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
so you're right. So
Yes,
so
we're
I
just
think
showing our age here.
we are showing our age rather, but yeah. But yeah, so to your point about conferences, I think uh conferences, it's a very interesting thing with conferences, because I think conferences are a great opportunity to get excited and inspired. I
Mm.
love doing conferences. I love talking at conferences.
Yeah,
Some of that I have had genuinely career changing moments that occurred at QCons, for
yeah.
example. Like,
Me too.
there's one I trot out from time to time, but it is absolutely true. I went into a room, was before AWS existed, or at least was public, and it was someone from Amazon talking about their deployment pipeline, and the fact that they were deploying to production multiple times a day. And I'd never heard anything like it. I mean, now, of course, this is absolutely routine, but at the time, I think we were deploying 4 times a year to production, and we were like pretty cutting edge. Do you know what I mean? Like we were pretty good, right? And there was this guy,
Read it 4 times a year.
and there was this chat from Amazon saying, yeah, yeah, we literally deploy to the website multiple times a day, and you're like, huh? And just that was it was such a sort of game changing moment. But I also think it's true that the amount that you remember from a conference talk is not a lot,
No.
right? I normally say, when I'm mentoring new speakers, I normally say to them, really and truly, if someone comes out of the room and remembers 3 things you said, you're doing pretty well, right? What they will remember is how you made them feel and the sort of sense and the impression, and they might even think 6 months later, "Gosh, I wonder whether there's a video of that because I seem to remember that so and so. I seem to remember Anne saying something like that about. I wonder what she said." But they won't
Yeah.
remember what you said. Chances are,
No.
unless they
No.
like writing a lot of notes, right? But
Yeah.
generally, um, so the immense advantage of written communication. Well, I think there are 2 immense advantages of written communication. One advantage
Well,
of it
well,
is you can.
I'm gonna break in here and
Go on,
say
then.
that actually, because I really like what you said about, yeah, it's terrible. Conferences are terrible for communicating the actual details of the information. As you say, you do have to go off and read it, but they're amazingly good for giving you the motivation to go off and do the reading, because what they provide you with is social proof. Like,
Yeah.
is everybody going, "Oh yeah, that sounded like a good idea," and it's where you all come together and go, is that a stupid idea or is that a great idea?
Yes.
Um, and that's it. That's the first step, really.
Oh, 100%. And also the value of being in a group of your peers and being able to just have that, we talk about the hallway track a lot, right? But that ability
Mm.
to go up to a speaker who might be the world authority on a thing and go, "Have you got a minute? Can I just ask you?" And have that conversation. Like
Mm.
that's amazing. I'm a huge fan. I probably speak at 7 or 8 big conferences and several meetups a year and go to more. Like, I'm a huge fan. I'm absolutely
Yeah,
not knocking it. I'm just saying I think it's a mistake to imagine that there's a mistake that I see people fall into a lot with communication, which is that they imagine that if you communicate a thing once, it is communicated. And as you all know, that's not true. And you have to keep making similar points or the same points or finding new ways to say things, but you also need different. We talk a lot about learning surfaces, which is a slightly bizarre word or bizarre phrase, but really all we mean is people learn differently. So some people are very visual, some people are, I basically learn by reading, but some
yeah,
people learn by drawing diagrams or looking at pictures or whatever. I'm not a very visual thinker, so that doesn't really work for me. But my point
yeah,
is, you need to have a if you're trying to communicate something, you need a variety of different ways to communicate that can communicate it. Conferences is one, written, which is kind of my favorite area, really is another.
yeah.
But they're all, it's all variations on a theme, right?
Well, so, oddly enough, I was thinking about this earlier today, and that the communications thing. I'm very pleased with the name of this podcast, Asynchronous and Unreliable.
I think
It's
it's
a
an
it's a
excellent name.
distributed systems term, and you can relate to these distributed systems terms to all kinds of communications. So, for example, a conference is in theory synchronous, but it's still unreliable, in that I would say, you're sitting there in front of people, you're talking and they're listening, so it's synchronous. Um, but you never know that you don't know whether they're actually listening. You don't know whether they're taking away what you think you're saying. It's unbelievably, it has the appearance of being synchronous, and it has the appearance of being reliable, but it's in fact utterly unreliable.
Oh, I
You
want to
do
quickly
not
yes
know.
and you on that because the other big difference between a conference and a book or a bit of reasonably serious technical journalism is with a book or a reasonably serious bit of technical journalism, someone will have fact checked it.
Ah,
And
yeah.
when someone is speaking,
Mm,
it's just their opinion, right?
yeah.
Their opinion might be very well founded and very well sourced, and they might
Yeah.
have done the research and done the fact checking,
Yeah.
but there is there is a big difference between that and you know an article that multiple people have gone through and followed up and gone, are you sure about that? Is that really true? And, wrong sources and gone, can you just confirm this is what you meant? And all the stuff that like proper journalism involves.
Mm,
Um, that stuff obviously doesn't happen with a conference talk. And
yeah.
so um, I think, again, I'm not saying they're not valuable. I absolutely think they're incredibly valuable, but there is definitely a distinction. So your unreliable thing, there's a level of, it's a bit like the difference between a personal blog and like the Times or something, where you would
Yeah.
hope that the Times would be a bit more serious on the fact checking.
Yeah.
Um,
So So I had an interesting discussion, oddly enough, with my husband, John, who you've met, and
Yeah.
is also on this podcast. And we both just read the new Hannah Ritchie book
Oh,
on
clearing
the
the
energy
air, that one.
cleaning the air, which is very good. And I would totally recommend it. It was excellent. And we both noted when we were reading it that there was a sentence towards the end of the book where you read it and you thought, well, I know that's not what you think. And then you read it again, you thought, I know that's not what you think. And it was quite clear that the word not had been omitted from the sentence. So the sentence was clearly and obviously the opposite of what it actually said. And it was a good reminder that professional editing, you're usually not edited. If you're not if you're not publishing, even if you're publishing with a tech publisher, a book is usually not edited by a tech editor.
Yeah.
And it's quite easy for an editor to apply grammatical rules, but not to apply the sense rules because they don't know the answer. So even with a book, if the editor isn't technical, you can't necessarily, you have to use your brain. You
Can
can't
I,
just
can I,
go,
that's just because it's reminded me, that's one of my favorite stories ever. So James Joyce, early 20th century Irish novelist, who wrote a particular style of writing, which is stream of consciousness, which is basically just, like imagining, trying to capture the thoughts that are running through your head. And over time, he got more and more extreme in terms of, he effectively kind of invents his own language as he goes. It starts off as being sort of Irish dialect. By the time you get to things like Finnegan's Wake, it's kind of, I mean, we used to joke at university that the only person who could possibly actually read this book and understand it was James Joyce. But there is a story, and I don't know, I will say I'm not 100% sure it's true, but it's a great story that Joyce he deliberately didn't correct mistakes that he found in the text at the proofreading stage, because he felt that they were sort of, it's almost like a sort of Marxist way of thinking about the means of production being part of the art form. And
yeah,
he supposedly anyway, kind of thought that the mistakes were actually adding to it. Right? Nothing is ever going to be perfect. And I've read books where the editing is dreadful or non-existent. It's quite interesting for me because I'm dyslexic. And so, which is, there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down there. But basically, I have someone who I used to have my wife do it, and increasingly my wife was like, "You're writing too much for me to edit." So I now have someone who works for me who edits my stuff, and she's brilliant, but she is not technical. So
yeah,
um, she does an amazing job, and we sort of work around that quite well. But every
yeah,
so often there'll be something where she's changed something, and I've used the word in a particular way for knowing my particular audience for that particular publication, and she's changed it in a way that actually changes the sense. But even though grammatically she's right,
yeah,
um, so it is interesting, and these things will slip through. And it's also, there's an absolute rule of my father-in-law used to run like a What's On magazine in Spain, and he used to say that he's standing in the printing press and you take the first magazine off the press, and the first thing you would see would be a typo. And it's like, it was just guaranteed. There was always one. It always slipped. It doesn't matter how many times. And there's something about like reading it in a different context. You suddenly spot it.
yeah.
And I mean, we've all had. I'm sure with your novels and things, you've had that experience where you go back and go, "How
Oh,
did that slip through?"
all
Yeah.
the time. It's unavoidable.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's interesting. I mean, as you say, through your career and through my career, which are broadly the same amount of time in tech, although so you came from a background of doing an English degree. I came from a background of not doing computer science degree. I did a physics degree, so I had to learn programming on the job.
Yeah.
And like you, early days, I didn't learn through magazines. Well, some magazines actually, I did learn quite a lot through magazines in the early days. There were some quite useful magazines, particularly from Microsoft. Um, you had books. You didn't even at that point. Then you had open source code, so you can actually look at other people's code, which was incredibly useful.
Yeah, that was really when that started to be a proper thing, that's hugely valuable, I think.
Yeah. Because one of the things in tech is it's like the William Gibson quotes, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." There's a
Mhm.
lot of people doing amazing stuff. Well, a lot of progress in tech happens through painful trial and error,
Yeah.
and then you don't want everyone to have to do that painful trial and error. So you really want to kind of do a bit of cross-pollination and find out what other people are doing, and then do that. So yes, so a lot of it is about, well, how do you share that knowledge? You know, as it is, you say, is it magazines? Is it books? Is it talking at conferences? The modern way, of course, the podcast.
Yes. Yeah, and as I say, I think you need a mixture of all of these things, really, is the answer. I mean, I don't mean you, one individual human necessarily needs to do all of these things, but I think collectively we need a lot of those things. The other thing that I increasingly feel very strongly, so I 100% agree with everything you said, and really I've sort of built the whole of the second half of my career around this idea of we need to get better at sharing our knowledge with ourselves as an industry because that's how we progress, right? That's kind of been a mantra of mine for, I'm going to say at least a decade, probably longer. But I'm increasingly interested by another thing, which is I also think we need to get much better at an industry of communicating what we're doing to people who are not technical. And the reason that I feel very strongly about that is because I feel increasingly that the work we're doing has an outside influence on people's lives, on society as a whole, in a way that was pretty unthinkable to me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly, right? And some of that's qualities of scale. So some of it's just, you know, software is so pervasive now and you put a piece of software out, then, you know, like when I started working professionally as a programmer, if I built an app for a company and maybe 40 or 50 people used it, and, you know, like, well, if 40 or 50 people are massively inconvenienced, it's annoying, but it's, you know, it's hardly a disaster. Well, as now, you know, even my little noddy like work website has several thousand people on it every day. You know, like it's just it's an order of scale difference that
Yes.
matters. But the other thing is a lot of the systems that we are building now, particularly now with AI, with large language models and their large transformer models, will dramatically and materially change society in weird and unpredictable ways. And I feel like as an industry, we need to get much better at thinking that through and then communicating it to the people affected rather than just assuming everyone's fine with it all the time, which is kind of our, you know, kind of like it's been the industry default for a long time of, you know, of course it's fine for me to like take all of the intellectual property of every creative on the planet and just use that to build my plagiarism machine. Why would you have a problem with that? Do you know what I mean? Like, and it genuinely, I've had these conversations with people, and they're genuinely surprised that you know other people have a different perspective on it. Um, so I just think there's a Leslie Lamport quote which I've found myself thinking about a lot recently, which is if you're not writing, you only think you're thinking, um, which I
So
like a lot.
who's Leslie? Who's the?
Leslie Lamport is a Turing Award winner. He's probably best known for something called the Lamport clocks, which was a way of doing distributed tracing, essentially.
Oh yeah.
He's a Turing winner. I met him actually. He did a talk at, I think it was QCon New York, and I interviewed him afterwards. I kind of ambushed him and said, "Can I interview you?" And he was very generous actually. But he's also done a lot around formal proofs and that kind of thing. And he's a really lovely, really interesting, you know, proper old whitebeards type programming type. But yes, I really like that. He has a few variations on it, but that I really like. Um, so I think there's a lot in that, but I also feel very strongly, as I say, we just need to get better at talking about what we're doing and you know, thinking about is the world that we are making the world we want to be making? Is this really the world we want? And if it isn't, you know, like, are there better applications of this technology than the things we're applying it to? And
Yeah.
I kind of feel like I don't know. I think we are in danger of going into quite a dark place with tech. Um, uh, and that's hard for me because, like, technology's been a huge part of my whole life. Like, I was been incredibly excited about computers since I was, in short trousers, which, as you can probably tell, was a while ago, right? Um, and so it's quite hard for me to be reflecting on this, but I think there's a real danger that we're using computers to do things that aren't really for the good of anybody, other than a few very, very rich white people who are getting richer and whatever. But beyond that, I think you can absolutely make an argument that technology has backed itself into a very dark corner. And I think part of our problem is we're not very good at talking to people about what we're doing and listening to what they think about it. And so that's kind of, yeah, I think it's a thing that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. Is how do we involve the people who are affected more in this conversation?
So it's interesting because we both worked together on actually even the step before that. When we were working on QCon London, we ran the first track at QCon. I've read the first track at any major tech conference, which is a tech ethics track, where we got
Yes.
people to come in and
Well,
talk
you were
about
hugely instrumental in that, of course. I mean, it was very much your idea. I think I merely smiled and nodded and said, "Yes, what a good idea." I think
wonderful.
was my involvement in that originally. Yeah, we were very ahead at the time on talking about ethics. And actually, we did a bunch on Insecure. I used to get, angry of Tunbridge Wells emails about our ethics coverage. So we were clearly upsetting people, which is always a good sign as a journalist, like you're not doing your job if someone isn't cross with you. But yeah, so we were quite early. And as I say, you were very instrumental in a lot of that. But that was kind of pre the large language model thing.
It was, yes. Yes, because the closing keynote we had on our track for the first time we did it at QCon, and no one was sure. Everybody thought that I was a bit, deranged, I think, with my suggestion of this track. And it was in the smallest possible room, which worked very well for me because it was absolutely packed.
Yeah, yeah.
And the closing keynote of the track, the first ever track, was by a chap called Steve Warswick. Did you see the track?
Yes.
Um, Steve Warswick was basically the earliest successful chatbot developer. He
Hmm.
developed a chatbot called. This was before LLMs existed. This was written in something called AIML, which was actually stood for AI markup language. It was like a choose your own adventure story. It was a
Yes.
written. It was a kind of animated book,
Yeah.
kooky, and he kept winning the Turing Prize for best human emulating chatbot. She won year upon year upon year, and so he gave the talk about how to write a chatbot that was that was good, that you felt proud to have written, that was supportive of people, that was a nice chatbot, that didn't
Yeah.
tell people to kill themselves. And he said it was actually a really difficult thing to write a chatbot that interacted like a human, but didn't agree with things like, "Oh, I think I should kill myself," because there is it's you actually had to learn and plan and check and make sure that
Mm,
that stuff wasn't happening. I would say when you listen to ChatGPT now, the way it talks is very like Steve Warswick. It's very like the way that he defined chatbots in the early days. I think he was strangely influential in a way that we do not appreciate these days. Very nice chap, working out of his back bedroom in Goole on producing the
yes.
world's top chatbot at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had some very interesting conversations with, psychologists and psychiatrists and things around the design patterns of chatbots and large language models. And those are conversations that get quite dark quite quickly. Um, but there is absolutely a problem with designing something that constantly wants you to think that it is not a machine.
Mm,
That does very, very bad things to a proportion of humans. And again,
mm,
wouldn't very much matter if you were talking about half a dozen people, but you're not talking about half a dozen people. I forget what what ChatGPT's usage figures were last time I looked at them, but it was something like
It,
1/10
it's
of the planet,
it's
or
about it's just a little bit under a billion.
yeah, right. So roughly 1/10 of the world's population is using
Yes.
ChatGPT at least part of the
Yeah.
time, right? So these systems have a very outsized impact, and you know, just there have been cases of people who have committed suicide as a result. Well, okay, as a result is a bad choice of words. Sorry, go with me here. Suicide is complicated, right? You can't, cause and effect is really hard to say, but
Mm.
who were encouraged to do so through their interactions with a large language model. That's fairly well documented at this point. There are an awful lot of examples of people who have gone into some form of psychosis as a result of interacting with large language models. Um, this stuff is quite dangerous and very poorly understood by an awful lot of people. And I think I have a I have a sort of theory that's not really a theory. I have this idea that one of the problems with large language models is they break a whole lot of our own heuristics as humans. So because a large language model sounds very human, we ascribe intelligence to it that it doesn't exhibit,
Mm.
because we use our language as a shortcut for assessing how smart somebody is,
Oh,
right?
oddly enough, I've heard a similar comment made about English people, British people, that they sound a lot more intelligent than they are.
Yeah, well, and we do it. I mean, it's awful, but we do it all the time, right? If someone speaks in as an English person, if someone speaks to you in a thick East End accent, like a strong East End accent, you probably instinctively think they're a bit less smart than they actually are. Or someone who speaks differently to how you speak is probably a better way to put that, right? There's a bunch of, frankly, prejudices there, but I think the converse is also true, that because the large language model sounds quite human, all it is a token predictor, right? But we think it's much cleverer than it is. We think it's much cleverer than, say, our house cat, even though our house cat is probably exhibiting far more intelligent behaviors than your large language model is. It just doesn't speak to you in English. And so I think there's something in that. I know as an editor, if someone sends me AI generated copy, which I try not, I generally these days refuse to edit, but you know, from time to time one has to, and it is the most joyless thing in the world to edit. And the reason it's the most joyless thing in the world to edit is partly because it's written really badly. Like it just is very poor writing, but also because you have to fact check every single fact. While as
Yes, you
with a
do.
human, I can usually have a pretty good idea of, do I need to fact check this or not? With a large language model, I have no idea. So it breaks all of
Yes.
my heuristics. So I have to fact check everything, which is unbelievably tedious. It's also one of those things where it's all surface. So it's exactly the opposite of what you want in a piece of writing, right? It looks great until you think. And as soon as you start thinking, you're like, this is awful. Um, it's like a whole bunch of, like, hundreds and hundreds of words signifying nothing. And so it's this sort of weird combination of it as I say, if you don't understand, if you don't appreciate an art form, then it does a very, very good impression of something that sounds quite convincing. Like, people use Hannah, who I do AI for the rest of us with, did a bit of music that she had AI generated, and she was quite excited by it, and I thought it was awful. And and she won't mind me saying that, because we made quite a joke
Yeah.
about it at the time. But to me, it doesn't sound like music. But then that's because I love music and I spend a bunch of time thinking about how music works, and so it
Yeah.
doesn't sound like music at all to me.
Yeah.
Um, it sounds like something that sounds like the sort of thing that somebody who didn't know what music sounded like but had read about it in a book might produce, which isn't that surprising because it's essentially what it is, right?
Yeah.
And with copy, what you end up with is these vast sort of tracks of text, and you start, one of the things you do a lot as an editor is you're trying to find the sort of nugget and redlining it, right? And you end up redlining the entire bloody thing because there's just nothing there, right? When you first look at it, it looks okay. So there's a sort of weird, and and by the way, like for some context, that's totally fine. If you're doing, listicles for BuzzFeed or something, it probably doesn't really matter very much, right? You could probably use a large language model to generate those. But for anything where the meaning is important, I find anyway, it works against you all the time. I find it the very opposite of helpful. Now, as I said, I'm dyslexic, so like using it as a spell checker, it is the world's best spell checker. My goodness, like if I'm doing email, which used to be one of my absolute dreads because my typos in emails are just horrendous and there's never time to go and read it afterwards. So like chucking it into Claude and saying any typos, wonderful. Using it for doing transcriptions of interviews if I'm in a hurry, quite useful up to a point. But using it to actually write, just like, no.
But ironically, I agree. I love AI and use it for all kinds of things. And this podcast, amazing at like doing all kinds of AI enhanced cleaning up of audio and all. It's amazing, and I do
Oh,
like
yeah.
ChatGPT. I love chatting to ChatGPT. But ironically, the worst thing is it's writing. It's always saying, "Shall I write some text for you?" I'm like, oh no, because it's so awful. I can't bear it. It's so wordy.
Yeah.
I was spent. Just like no, you can say that in like a tenth what you've taken to say that. Say, Charles, you have often been my editor over the years. You are my I won't say you're my favorite editor because some of the other editors might be listening, and I love you all. But
One of your favorite editors.
one of my favorite editors. Um, but the Yeah, but I've done quite a lot of editing myself, and as you say, and I do a lot of editing of my own stuff. And the first thing you have to do is go. It's always too wordy at first. That's
Yeah.
the main fault of everything. It's always too wordy. You're just going, how can I make that clearer? How can I make it so that it's not like 6 clauses when one clause would do? Yeah, so you have to read an enormous sentence before you can understand the meaning of the sentence. You try and make it so that you can understand the meaning as you're going along, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And just it's very easy to say effectively the same thing 3 times in 3 consecutive sentences. That's very, very common. In fact, for anybody who has not done a heavy amount of editing of you will find that whenever you write your novel or whenever you write your book, every paragraph, you're writing the same thing 3 times, and you have to pick one, pick
Yes.
one of the 3
Yes.
and keep that. But ChatGPT, much as I like using it, it never picks one.
No. And it'll write the 3 and then it'll probably do like 5 hours of subclauses as well, just to, people talk about the M dash a lot, which drives me mad because it's a bit of punctuation I actually have used for years. And suddenly everyone thinks that, oh, you've used AI because you've got an M dash in there, which is utter
I know,
nonsense.
I love M dash.
But the reason it does it is because it's basically using it for yet another subclause. And it's, there's only so many commas you can have. So I'll M dash it. And, so it's a paragraph long sort of gobs of endless subclauses.
Well, the thing is that AI has a huge context window. And so it can hold an enormous sentence with loads and loads of subclauses in its head. And one of the things you learn when you actually wanting to write simple stuff that people can understand is that when you write, you tend to have a lot of subclauses, and then you have to go and unwind the subclauses so that you kind of like have maximum 3 per sentence, and even then, that's a bit of a push.
Yes.
So that when you can read a sentence as you go, you don't have to get all the way to the end of the sentence before you understand what the sentence meant. Is really
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yes. And it's so, I think, there's a sort of, there's another interesting aspect to that, which is one of the things that's interesting when you're doing technical writing, particularly, is the temptation always to use very technical language to describe something. And that's because that's easy, right? Because that's the language that you instinctively know.
Mm.
And quite often it's the wrong it's actually the wrong way to do it. But to actually step back and go, well, what do I mean when I talk about X or Y? What is that actually? What does that term actually mean? And giving the context is really interesting. Um, and some of that's understanding who your audience is. But I would argue, even with a technical audience, a lot of the time, it's very easy to fall into this sort of very lazy trope of just using a lot of very complicated, you know, calling a spade an earth inverting horticultural implement, that kind of idea. Right? It's very easy to sort of fall into that trap, where
Mm.
what you actually want to do is to get back to what is the simplest, cleanest, most concise way I can get this point across without
Mm.
using masses and masses of jargon to do it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, indeed. And not expecting that what you wrote down out of your head, you are not James Joyce. Don't stick to your stream of
No,
consciousness
no,
writing with very complicated, difficult to parse.
I always say to people, I genuinely, I've been doing this a long time now, and I don't let people read my first drafts, like, ever.
Mm.
I do my first drafts. I draft everything in Pages because I have a Mac. But one of the reasons I draft everything in Pages is because it's on my machine and no one else will ever see it. And only at a point when it's not awful will I put it into Google Docs or wherever it's going to the publisher. Like, there is a draft before the draft that anyone sees, which is just, I just throw words at a screen until I've got words, and then I'll go and, fix it up. And sometimes that fixing up is, you know, whole paragraphs or whole sections need to go or move, or, it's not just striking out words. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, quite often I'll throw away whole sections of a thing that just, oh, well, that was an interesting digression. It's absolutely no purpose in being there. Should we get rid of it? And sometimes those things are hard, right? Sometimes you need to go and have a cup of tea afterwards and pull yourself together. Because sometimes it's something you're really proud of and you want it to stay, but it's like, but it's got no, it doesn't add anything.
Yeah, I think we're all guilty of that to a certain extent. Something we just, yeah, well, we're all definitely guilty of that. In that, you cannot show the first. Well, if you're writing a novel, you can't show the first 3 drafts to someone, and after
Yes,
that, you can only show it to the person who's used to using looking at stuff and then going, "That's rubbish. This
yes.
is going to have to go. I didn't understand this. I didn't have the, it's before someone who you have less psychological safety with. It's at least 6 drafts, I would say, before they see them. If it's a novel or it's a longer piece of writing.
There's an interesting parallel for me with the music that I do. So there is always a point where we will play a new piece of music to somebody. So they will be in the studio. It'll be someone we know who we admire, and we'll
Mm.
sit there and play it to them. And it's really interesting because the point of that isn't what they tell you. The point of it is how you hear it when someone else is listening, which is a completely different thing from how you hear it when no one is listening. And it's
Mhm.
so, so interesting. And suddenly you go, oh, God, those 8 bars are really boring. Or, that drum fill that I was so happy with doesn't work at all. Or, what on earth is that line doing? you know, but there are all these things like, I'm embarrassed on your behalf because that was so bad. Like, and that stuff never happens if you don't, at some point, you have to play it to an audience in whatever way that is, and that's the only way. So with a novel, it's someone reading it and giving you feedback, right?
Yeah.
But for other things, it might be a slightly different, a slightly more interactive way of doing it. But it's the same thing. You need that. You need that feedback. That's how we learn. That's why pair
Yes.
programming is such a good idea.
Yeah.
Same thing, because you get feedback and you learn from other people.
And that is kind of the difference, or being a conference, is that although you're only kind of taking away the vibes, it's kind of vibe learning, isn't it? Does everyone look interested in this? Is everybody um, horrified by what they're hearing? Are they interested by what they're hearing? I mean, I've given a lot of controversial talks where I've talked. About something that you think, I know that this isn't something that folk normally hear. So maybe it's about ethics, maybe it's about new things about code efficiency or whatever, but things that people are going to be a bit shocked to hear, or it's not what they normally hear.
Hmm.
And you look out at people and they're looking at you totally blank faced, and you think, I have no idea how this is landing at all. This was going to be a total disaster. And then everybody goes away and no one comes up to you afterwards, which is a bad sign. That
But
it's like no one
never.
comes up to you afterwards. And I've done that before, and I've thought, oh, that was a disastrous talk. And then after the coffee break, then the next coffee break, people have come up to me and said, "Oh, I enjoyed your talk." And I thought, you went away at last coffee break. People talked about whether or not that was an acceptable talk to alike, and they decided that it was okay. And then only after that did they come back and say to me, "No, it was I
Interesting.
enjoyed the talk, but I had to
I, wo-
check whether I really did enjoy the
I
talk." Or
wonder also whether if something is genuinely new, particularly if it's new and a bit uncomfortable, I think
Mm,
we all need a bit of time to process that before we're ready to talk about it. I had a vaguely, I'm going to be a bit careful about what I say because this could come out wrong. I did a talk last year in Germany, and while I was doing it, I thought it was a total disaster. Like tumbleweed. No, nothing from the audience at all. And I don't know if that's because it's a German audience and I'm English or and just, like wasn't reading the room well or whatever. But it was hard for me to do it because I just felt like, nothing is landing. I have never had so many people come up and talk to me afterwards. But while I was giving and like, with really interesting questions and points of view and like the interaction afterwards was amazing, but the bit in the room was like I could feel my confidence kind of draining out through the bottom of my feet because like no one's laughing, no one's even smiling, it's like there's nothing happening at all. And like, God, have I totally lost my touch? It's terrifying. Um, and it is interesting when you go around and do like international conferences and speak to different audiences that certain things that will land in one location won't land in another. And I mean, you and I both talk quite a lot about sustainability, and that's, there are people who are still really uncomfortable with that conversation. I did a talk on AI and sustainability for YAL at the back end of last year, so out in Australia. It was one of the best conference experiences I've ever had. Wonderful, wonderful people, brilliant organization, absolutely fantastic. The way YAL works, they bring a bunch of international speakers in and you do 3 cities. So you sort of travel around like a road trip. It's great fun. Um, 3 very different audiences. So you do Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney. And I think it was Brisbane. There were some people who were really cross with me afterwards, like
really?
properly cross. Not in a nasty way, but just like, you've got no idea about how important mining is to the Australian economy. And, we can't back away from fossil fuels for all of these reasons. And, that was essentially, I'm slightly paraphrasing a much longer conversation, obviously, but that was sort of the gist of it. But it's been a while. I get climate change deniers at every talk I do, more or less. But that's the first time in a while I've had someone who it wasn't a denial of climate change. They were utterly accepting that what I was saying was probably scientifically fair. They were just saying it isn't realistic.
Yeah.
And actually, it's really interesting if you look at the electricity map. If you look at the electricity mix in Australia, not great from an environment. You'll know one of our standard things is, find a green location and run there. And that's really hard in Australia. Essentially, your choice is New Zealand or
Yeah.
possibly Tasmania, which, isn't, as it turns out, exactly on the doorstep. But, like the energy mix in Australia which surprised me because I imagined, it's a lot of sun. Surely you'll have lots
Yeah.
of solar panels. That would seem like a
Oh,
really
well,
interesting thing.
they've gone quite solar panel, crazy. Great stuff. They've made some really amazing
It is
improvements to
happening.
solar
I mean,
panels
the shift
in
because of
Australia.
mainly because of the Chinese manufacturing of solar panels and
Mm,
also the efficiency. So you've got 2 things that are happening. One, they've got cheaper, and I mean, all
mhm.
this, right? But one, they've got way cheaper. 2, they've got way more. It's a bit like if you remember going from sort of 286 to 386 to 486, and Pentiums and whatever. It's a bit like that at the moment with solar panels. Like every year you look at them and go, "Sorry, how much better?" Like
Yeah.
we did the solar panels here about 8 or 9 years ago, and we've got quite a big. I think we have 16 panels or something like that out in the garden, And if we did them now, I could probably run the entire house on them all year round. I certainly can't do
Yeah.
that with them. They've got a lot better, is my point, and a lot
Well,
cheaper.
so it is interesting because I mean I've got solar panels that I put in. A bit like you, I was kind of like, are they good enough yet? But they're going to get better. When do we go?
Mm,
When at some point you have to go. I'm going now. So we put them in 2022. We've got quite a lot, and they produce extraordinary amounts of power in the summer and even in the spring and the autumn, enough to run the house. But the winter, it's still pretty much none because it doesn't matter how many you've got, much you've got. There's almost no power being
yeah,
generated in the winter.
yeah. I mean, there are, there are seasonal effects, and
Yeah.
that's going to be a thing, and yeah, using 100% renewables for the grid is actually quite a hard problem. Although it gets a lot easier when you start interconnecting grids. Um,
Absolutely.
Again, you will know all of this, but like there are places in Europe where it's sunny when it's not sunny in, say, Scotland, and
Indeed.
we could run a cable and start sharing renewables more, and we do a lot of this already. It's just an extension of stuff we're doing anyway.
And wind often is often a counterpoint to solar. So if you've got a whole load
Yes.
of wind, well, then you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, there are other things. You can have a bit of nuclear on the
Yeah.
NES as well, which gives you a bit of background load. Again, I know it's a bit controversial, but it is a carbon-free energy source, and so there are a variety of ways you can do this that will work out. And I think, I mean, as you and I are recording, I'm not sure how quickly this will actually appear, but as you and I are recording, the war in Donald Trump's war in Iran is ongoing. We are
Yeah.
seeing a massive spike in the prices of fossil fuels. Um, there is a bizarre narrative in the UK media, in the UK right wing media, that what this means is we need more of our own fossil fuels, which is such a deep misunderstanding of both the problem and fossil fuels. Like, having our own doesn't make any difference to this problem because we sell them on the international market at a fixed
Yeah.
rate. Also, there isn't a lot left in our bit of the North Sea, etc., etc., etc. What this is telling you is we need to get the heck off fossil fuels really quickly. Um, and actually, the UK's made good progress in that regard, which was a surprise to me. That long ago, I didn't think that was going to happen. But actually, we've made, other countries have done better, but we've done pretty well. We have you know, we have a much better energy mix than we did not that long ago, at least for things like electricity, which for
That's
our
true.
industry is the key thing.
And if listeners to this podcast want to read someone who we both approve of massively when it comes to communicating all of this stuff, it is Hannah Ritchie. Um,
Yeah, so I recommend her book, Not the End of the World, to literally everybody. It's in
yeah,
every talk on the subject that I do. I joke, but it is true. So when I was a teenager and thinking about what I wanted to do, one of the things I wanted about doing was climate science. I thought I might go and be a climate scientist. And then I read lots about climate science and got quite depressed, to be truthful. And that's why I ended up doing an English literature degree, more or less. I mean, it's not quite true, but it's sort of half true. The other reason I did an English literature degree is because I had an English teacher who told me I shouldn't because I was dyslexic, and I kind of hated him. So I kind of went and read English literature mostly to annoy him, I think. But both of these things are kind of true. But I always joke that with Hannah Ritchie's book, if I'd read Hannah Ritchie's book as a teenager, I might well have ended up a climate scientist. It's wonderful.
yeah,
I
yeah,
really rate her. I don't agree with some of the things that she says around large language models. I don't agree with, or more accurately, I think are um, slightly lacking in nuance. I know where she's coming from, but I think there is an argument, and it is true, that your use of a large language model doesn't affect your individual carbon profile very much, right? And so you shouldn't worry about using a large language model as an individual human, and that's true, 100% true. But I also think it's quite unhelpful because I think the problem with large language models is a one of scale,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
that's a conversation. Again, that comes back to the scale thing, right? The problem isn't. I mean, actually, there's two problems with it. One, she's averaging out stuff, uh, and large language models, like a single query in a large language model, is so inherently unpredictable in terms of how much energy it actually uses. Not averaging is unhelpful. But the other thing is, I think it misses the point that really the problem is. I don't think she misses the point, but I think there's a danger that people who read what she's saying miss the point that the problem isn't your use, it's the building out the infrastructure at such speed is the problem.
Yeah.
Um, um,
So,
go
so
on.
I'm going to wrap you up somewhat on that one, in that I think we'll either we or actually I've got quite a few speakers on to talk about that very subject, and I may well have you back to talk about it because there's a lot to talk about green AI
Yes.
and
Oh, they're
what
so
would
weird.
yeah.
That's so weird. A lot of my day job at the moment is doing AI related stuff, and it's
Oh, yeah. Well,
fascinating.
unsurprisingly, isn't it? Because it's the
It's
big
like,
thing.
you know, go where the work is, right?
Indeed, yeah. And we also talk, and I knew it's a complicated subject, and it's one where, well, that's a whole thing of AI. It's not all AI. Some AI is so much more eff- efficiently targeted to the task than others.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
if
Yes.
you go in thinking it's all or nothing, AI is good or bad, you're a doomer in some sense. In that it kind of makes you think, oh well, I might as well just go for it because it's all bad, and it's not. It's like no, it could be bad or it could be fine depending on how you choose to use
There's a
this. What?
general, there's a really interesting thing there, and it's a point that I make. I tend to do it more at university. So I do a certain amount of talking at universities, and it's a point I make more in university talks than elsewhere. But it is true that one of the really unfortunate things that happened to the climate movement was that a bunch of people who don't understand psychology got involved in the messaging. And the
Yeah,
messaging essentially says we're all going to die. And it
yeah,
turns out that when you give that message to people repeatedly, they don't go, this is a thing we better fix. They go, well, maybe I'll be too drunk to notice. Um, and it's really unfortunate because it's not true, right? Like
yeah,
this is a bunch of problems we can solve, but
yeah,
it's why you end up with the very well-meaning Just Stop Oil people throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh paintings. Like that's going to help.
yeah,
Um, like the way you get out of this hole is by doing really good engineering and building more
yeah,
efficient solar panels and
yeah,
working out how to store electricity, which is a problem we haven't had to solve. Like it's all engineering and thinking, and it's all solvable, right? We just,
yes,
we're really good at solving this stuff. But I mean,
yes,
some of it's really hard. Like feeding food is a real problem,
yeah,
right? But my basic point is coming back to the communication thing. There are ways to what you want to say to people about green, and it is true. Is this is not a doomsday scenario. This
no,
could be very bad, right? But it doesn't have to be. That it's only as bad as we choose to make it. And actually, do you know what? We're making really good progress. I was
yeah,
like genuinely, because as I said, I'd gone away from the thing. I hadn't really looked at the field for 30 years because I got so depressed. And then I only really came back to it about a decade ago. And I was stunned at how much progress had been made. And like, I
yeah,
genuinely had no idea.
yeah,
I kept reading things and go, oh, I was wrong. I was totally
yeah,
wrong. I was wrong about that as well. Like the ozone hole. We signed the Montreal Agreement and we stopped releasing ozone depleting gases. I had like genuinely, I didn't know that.
yeah.
Because if you watched the news, you wouldn't, right?
No,
Because the
because
news,
it
the news
never
only ever
crossed
told
my
you about the hole in the ozone layer, and then it stopped telling you there was a hole in the ozone layer. They didn't say, oh, by the way, I mean, there is still a hole in the ozone layer, to be clear. But what it didn't say is, oh, by the way, that problem isn't getting any worse. And over
yeah,
time, it is in fact getting better.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I think I think it's just an interesting example with communication about so often we use the wrong tool to communicate something because we don't think through the we don't think carefully enough about what it is we're trying to communicate or what effect we want to have.
absolutely. Now, I'm probably going to wrap us up at about this because we've now talked for an hour, and it's been a very topic and idea and concept dense conversation, which I'm not going to be able to trim much out of. So it's going to be a full hour.
Sorry, I do
I've
tend to
really,
rub it on. It's terrible.
but I've really enjoyed it. So I'm
Yeah,
hoping that I will be able to persuade you to come back again
I
onto
would be
the.
delighted to come back. Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much more we could talk about. So that would be wonderful. Anytime.
So I'm gonna just let you know. Um, there are going to be show notes for this talk, and then hopefully I'll put in links and information in the show notes so you'll be able to see what we've been talking about and look it up and read it and do your own fact checking, because as Charles pointed out, a podcast is a little bit like a conference talk. But most of the time when you're listening to a podcast, there's no fact checking going on. So do bear that in mind. But anyway, so thank you, everybody who's listening. Thank you again for listening to Asynchronous and Unreliable podcast. And hopefully I will catch you again at the next recording. So goodbye from me. And
Oh yes, and goodbye from me, and thank you, Anne, so much. Always lovely to chat to you, and that was huge fun. I hope it's fun to listen to as it was to record.
hopefully so.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to Asynchronous and Unreliable podcast. If you enjoyed the show and you want us to create more content, please do show your support by hitting the subscribe button below. It really does make a difference. Thank you very much.